All right, it's a rainy night in Georgia for some voter suppression enthusiasts. Stacey Abrams is making her second bid to be Georgia's governor after narrowly losing to Governor Brian Kemp in 2018 under an intentionally flawed voter system designed to favor Republicans.
I did not challenge the outcome of the election, unlike some recent folks did. What I said was that the system was not fair. And leaders challenge systems. Leaders say, we can do better. And that's what I declared. I could not, in good conscience, say that in order to protect my political future, I'm going to be silent about the political present, which is that we had a system under a leader that sought to keep people from casting their ballots, that threw those ballots out, that said that voter suppression was a viable tactic for winning elections.
Between flipping blue last year and helping to deliver the power of the federal government to Democrats, Donald Trump feuding with his own acolyte, Brian Kemp, and Raphael Warnock's Senate race likely to spur voters to the polls. That midnight train to Georgia just might lead to a historic victory for Abrams. Joining me now, the co-founder of Black Voters Matter, LaTosha Brown, who looks like she's joining us from a winter wonderland, and political reporter for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, Greg Bluestein, who's clearly losing the battle in Room Raiders this morning. Thank you guys both for joining me. LaTosha, I'm going to start with you. Should Abrams prevail, she will become the first black woman governor in U.S. history. This would be a really big deal. However, I am concerned about the voter suppression schemes happening there in Georgia. Brian Kemp, longtime champion of voter suppression. What needs to happen on the ground there to ensure her victory, Senator Raphael Warnock, and that people have a clear path to the ballot box?
You know, it is going to be an uphill battle. What we saw is in 2018, we didn't have the presence of SB 202, which is the bill that was passed last year that was specifically designed to marginalize black voters and voters, Democratic-leaning voters in the state. However, some things have changed as well from organizers doing the work directly on the ground. Since 2018, we've been able to capture, the Democrats have captured 2 congressional seats, they've captured 3 state Senate seats and 12 House of Representative seats because the base is becoming solidified. And so I think it's going to be a very competitive race, and I think that she has an amazing opportunity to be able to go in as the first black governor of the state of Georgia. And we need new, bold leadership.
Yeah, I agree. Greg, I want to turn to you because Stacey Abrams has some quite huge endorsements of her. And I want to play a soundbite for you from one of her biggest endorsers, it seems. And we will talk about that on the other side of the break.
When Stacey Abrams says, I'm not going to concede, that's okay. No problem. Oh, she's not going to concede. She's not going to concede. Of course, having her, I think, might be better than having your existing governor, if you want to know the truth. Might very well be better.
He's pretty much endorsed her, although he's also endorsed Herschel Walker. So I don't know how you balance those two things. But what impact will that have on the race, Greg?
Yeah, this might very well be the biggest test of Donald Trump's influence in the nation in the midterms, because as you just heard, he's still denigrating Brian Kemp, who he endorsed in 2018. He's still fighting this feud with his own party in Georgia. He's endorsed an entire slate of Republican office holders for higher office, going against incumbents in many cases. And so Republicans are going to continue to war with each other, which is basically a gift for Democrats in Georgia who've been told about the parallels to Virginia. But Democrats in Georgia can say, look, not only is the electorate in Georgia much more diverse than the Democratic electorate in Virginia, but also Republicans here have to worry about this infighting that Virginia Republicans didn't have to worry about.
Yeah, absolutely. And do you think Brian Kemp even survives the infighting from the Republican Party? I mean, is this guaranteed that this is the person that Abrams will face off with, Greg?
Yeah, this is maybe the biggest question in Georgia politics right now, because former Senator David Perdue is leaning towards a run. We're not sure if he's going to pull the trigger yet, but he is leaning towards a run right now, and he would be a very formidable candidate. He lost to John Ossoff just a few months ago, but was a one-term U.S. senator, and he would have Donald Trump's endorsement. And at that very same rally, Donald Trump stood up there on that podium and begged David Perdue to run. So this infighting is far from over in Georgia.
Yeah, we can't assume that it will be an Abrams-Kemp rematch. LaTosha, something interesting about the state where I grew up, Georgia, and you and I have talked about this a lot. Black voters are the base vote there. Black voters represent nearly half of the vote in Georgia. However, Latino and Asian Americans have been key demographics to Georgia's registered voters since 2016. So this multi-ethnic coalition of voters there will be quite powerful. Will that be enough to leapfrog over the voter suppression schemes, and what kind of activity are you seeing bubbling up right now?
Listen, I have to be honest and say part of the reason why organizations and people like myself and others have been pushing Congress to pass federal legislation to protect the right to vote is because we're in an uphill battle. That what we're seeing in the state of Georgia, the Republicans are using every trick possible to be able to weaponize the administrative process, to take over election boards. They've actually drawn a district in the last 10 years. What the census shows us that 100% of the population growth in the state of Georgia have been communities of color. Yet they have created and drawn a district that they have an advantage, right, of districts in the state. That is how much they're willing to go to cheat to try to maintain power so that the minority rules. The good thing is that, as you said, there are more people that are engaging. There is a broad-based, multiracial, multi-generational coalition that has been working together and has been building for the last decade. And we saw the results in 2020 and 2020. We saw many of the results on local races in 2021, and I think we'll continue to see the strength of those voters. But we need to have federal legislation to protect, to make sure that the Republicans are not weaponizing the administrative process against the growth that's happening here.
Yeah, and I just want to correct our banner there. It is Black, Latino, and Asian American voters there. The Asian American community in Georgia is a powerful, fast, quickly growing voting bloc there. Greg, Atlanta has a new mayor. Andre Dickens comes from the city council. He was just elected this week. I'm sorry, we're still Saturday, so he was just elected this week. What impact do you think that will have? Because a lot of people think of Georgia as Atlanta, and Atlanta is just a city. Georgia's a big territory surrounded by a lot of red specks there. But I'm just curious what impact his election might have on this bigger race.
Yeah, I mean, really, it was a sign that Atlanta's electorate is becoming more progressive. He came from those progressive roots. He had endorsements from many of his predecessors and many fellow colleagues on the city council. He was an Atlanta city councilman. But he's coming in with some big ideas and some very progressive ideas about housing, affordable housing, about income inequality, about criminal justice. He had endorsements from many of Atlanta's and Georgia's main Democratic leaders because of those ideas. And his first real mission is to reset relations with state Republican leaders who are trying to basically pass legislation that would de-annex about a fifth of the city, the wealthy white northern part of the city called Buckhead.
Wow. Well, we will have a lot to talk about in the coming months when it relates to Georgia. I look forward to having you both back many times. Thank you so much, LaTosha Brown and Greg Bluestein. And coming up